Hey folks, Steve Sweeney here with Headwaters for Heroes with another session of Conversation with Heroes. Today's session is brought to you by G2 Ranch in Pearsall, Texas. We thank Don and Sandy Gilchrist down there for their generous donations they've always given to Headwaters for Heroes, and they're great support and great allies of ours. But today, we are featuring Marine Sergeant, Purple Heart veteran, Marine Sergeant Nestor Hernandez from San Angelo, Texas. Nestor, welcome, and I'm glad you're here. You and I have known each other for quite a while, and this is one of those sessions where I really look forward to because there's a whole bunch to unpack about you.
Yeah.
So welcome. Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So a little bit about me. Joined the Marine Corps in 2007 and was at MCRD in California. And once I guess became a Marine, got sent to my MOS school, which was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And that's where my MOS is 0811 Field Artillery Cannoneer. And so once I graduated there, then I got sent to 43 area, Las Pulgas, in Camp Pendleton. And that's where I stayed with my unit my entire time of service, which was almost 5 years. I had to extend my contract for my second deployment. So I guess first deployment was in 08. I went to, it was later we were told it was a booze cruise more than up the deployment. We got to go to Singapore, Dubai, Australia, Jordan, Kuwait, pretty much all the Middle East. And we got to train with Jordanians while we were there. And we were on ship, the USS Peleliu, LHA-5, which is now retired. But it was an experience that I was thankful for the second deployment that we got to go straight there and we didn't have to be floating around on a ship, you know.
I remember my dad's stories about basically floating to Korea to fight.
Yeah.
You know, so it's different. So you're born and raised in San Angelo, Texas.
I was actually born in Alpine, Texas.
Alpine. See,
Yes, sir.
I've just learned something new about you. I did not know that.
Yeah, I was born in Alpine and then lived there for about 5 years, right before you start school, and then moved to El Dorado, which I lived with my grandma and grandpa. And they raised me all up until I graduated, and in El Dorado. And then it wasn't until after I got out of the Marine Corps I decided to move to. I didn't want to move back home, but I wanted to still be close. So that's when I chose San Angelo. Yeah, because I tried to live out there in California, and it was, I loved the weather, and the art scene was really cool. There was always something to do. There was always something new. You could go up on the weekend to go snowboarding up in, I think it's Big Bear, or you could go surfing. I mean, there was always something to get into, good or bad. But unfortunately, it was very expensive. So I decided to pack up and move back to Texas, which I love Texas. I couldn't really imagine living anywhere else.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Well, San Angelo's a nice place. I mean, I've been out there quite a bit. Juan and I were filming an episode out there and got kicked out of one of the establishments.
Yeah.
That's a past life. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
But El Dorado, I like El Dorado. I used to go out there on business quite a bit, and they put on a great rodeo every year, and
Yeah.
so it's a nice little community.
Yeah, it's a tiny little town, but everyone there is, it's like family. Everybody knows everyone's business.
Right.
But
Whether you like it or not.
whether you like it or not, sometimes rumors get around that's like, wait, what? I did what?
Yeah. Well, I'm probably pretty impressed that I did that.
Yeah, okay. But San Angelo is just big enough, but just small enough that it's like its own little oasis. I enjoy San Angelo, and it's still growing. So I'm glad I
Yeah,
got
there's a
in when
lot
I
of
did.
refurbishing going on out there. I mean, the times that I've been out there, you're seeing some of the old downtown buildings, which is where your studio is, and
Yes.
we'll talk about that
Mhm.
soon. Um, there is that refurbishing, that revitalization, I guess
Mhm.
you'd say, that's coming, that is in San Angelo right now, and it's pretty good. But I agree with you. It's kind of a quiet town for the most part. What I've been there,
Mhm.
um, but you're right. It's just big enough, just small enough.
Right. Yeah.
So what pushed you to join the Marines?
Well, for the most part, all of my family has been either served in some way, either in law enforcement, either in medical field or military. And so um, my great grandfather, he was actually part of it was a CC camp um, out near Fort Davis, and it was during when Roosevelt was president, and their ranking and I think their structure was kind of leaned more towards like the army. So when he got out, he actually got out as a sergeant, um, never deployed, but he was active here in there in around Fort Davis. And then I had an uncle that had served, and then my mom's brother, he served. He was a Navy corpsman, and then other family members that had served, but no one had ever served in the Marines. Everyone had served either Navy or Army, and so I was the first one to go Marine Corps. My dad was a chief of police there in El Dorado, um, so I naturally wanted to serve, especially after 9/11. I was in 8th grade when that happened, and from that moment on, I knew I wanted to serve in our military, just because of the influence too that my uncle had on me, and so once I graduated, I'd made that decision like that's what I'm going to do. And I've never been really big on, all my other friends are going to college and they're, they know what college they're going to, and I had my heart set on joining the military, so um, I never really was into studying and doing all that. So military was my and I'm glad that I did. I learned a lot. I grew up very fast because I was pretty immature, after graduating, and joining the military will very quickly make a boy into a man,
I
for sure.
I believe that.
Yeah.
But what specifically about the Marines? What is it? You have several branches to choose from.
Sure.
What's you just said that you were the first one in your family to go to the Marines.
Mm.
Why the Marines?
And honestly, initially my uncle was pushing me towards Navy because he was a Navy corpsman, and SEALs was, in the talk of becoming a Navy SEAL. And I'd gone and talked to the Navy, and my senior year, I'd had a heat stroke. And when we went and talked to them, that was one thing that they kind of were like, you might want to look elsewhere. And so they pretty much looked at me like I was a liability. Like, if you already had a heat stroke and you've got heat issues, things like that, going Navy SEAL is probably not going to, it's going to end up not turning out like what you expected. So
That had to be disappointing.
yeah. And Army was, on the table. I went and talked to the Army. I just there it wasn't there when we conversated, and so when I went to the Marines, I walked in and was like basically asking, what can y'all, what does the Marine Corps provide for me? What kind of benefits there are, and the recruiter looked at me and was like, what is the Marines? What do they provide for you? Like, how about what do you provide, coming into the Marine Corps? And he's like, immediately he challenged me to see how many pull-ups I could do. And so I think it was just that challenge that he had initially kind of, poked at me. And I just liked the way that they kind of carried themselves. And then I just, the uniforms too
Yeah.
look sharp. And so I was like, I could see myself, doing that, and so that's why I ended up going Marine Corps. So, and just their legacy of, being, all the different wars and battles they had been in, and just stories I had heard of other Marines. It was just something I wanted to also follow in footsteps and be a part of that legacy, be a part of something bigger than myself.
Yeah,
sure.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we'll get back to deployments. When you enlisted, were you married? Were you single?
I was we had planned on getting married, and because we were high school sweethearts, and then after once living in California for a while, getting ready to go into deployment, we stayed together, and then it was about halfway through the deployment, she decided, this isn't for me. I cannot be a military wife, and so we parted ways. And at the time I was devastated, and I think that's where I prior to that I never drank. I was a good boy. I wasn't out. A lot of times after Friday night games, the guys would meet up and go out to someone's ranch and go drink, and I was watching film, getting ready for the next game, and and the fact too that my dad was chief of police, it was. He had a short leash on me, and so I didn't ever want to disappoint him, and so but it was at that point, once her and I broke, I was devastated. I thought that she was going to be my wife. I was all in, and so then that's when the drinking kind of started to come in, and crept in slowly, and then before I knew it, I was drinking any chance I got. So,
well, the service, and we've talked about this with others, the family serves right along with you. And sometimes the family just isn't prepared for that. And
yeah.
It's unfortunate, but as we've discussed before, you and I, that God has a plan. So we'll see where this plan goes. But so you're deployed and you learn all this, and Marines are already known for their party ethic.
Yes. Yeah, we were established in a Tun Tavern saloon, so.
So yeah, they're already known for that, and so that's an easy transition. I can see that easy transition there for you. But so when do you actually? Now I know you've got a daughter.
Yes.
You've got a couple daughters.
Mm-hmm.
One's from your first?
Yes. Yeah. My first, her name is Cadence. We had made the agreement because I just knew off the bat. For some reason, I knew I was going to have a girl. And so she wanted to have a boy. And so she said, we made the decision of I get to name the girl, she gets to name the boy. And I had come up with Cadence one morning while we were doing PT, and it was Marine Corps Cadence, and it kept being chanted, and I was like, Cadence is a really cool name. I've never met a Cadence, and so I had kind of stored that, and then sure enough, my first daughter, I got to name her Cadence. So and one thing, as she grew up, anytime she got fussy or couldn't sleep at night, I would almost hum the Marine Corps song to her, and she would just, for whatever reason, it would just put her to ease. And up until recently, now she's 8, just turned 9. She'd always, Daddy, will you? She called it the bum 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 song, and so I'd always, hum it to her, and so it was a special thing between her and I that she connected with that.
So how old was she when you were out on deployment?
I didn't have her until 2015, so I had already EAS'd out and was already living back in San Angelo. Yes, sir.
Okay. Because we one of the things that we talk about is when you're on deployment and you got family at home, and it's always I guess it's always a worry about them.
Yeah.
And so we worry about our family. So
yeah.
And your youngest,
my youngest Jade, she just turned 3, and man, she's complete opposite than the first. The first one, she's very mild, very, very quiet. Jade she's rambunctious, and she's a little firecracker. Like, she will, I could see her, you know, fitting in really well being in military. If she and that's probably what she will one day, she'll need that structure, for sure. But I'd hope that both of my girls go into the military, because I feel like that will, in the future, you know, all I would ask is that they do for at least one term, and then they can make their decision on if they want to stay in or not. But I know serving for me there's been so many doors that have opened just for the fact that I served. The fact that I own my house right now, I wouldn't have been able to afford, you know, without the VA home loan, to be able to get the home that I have now. So I am thankful for all the opportunities that are out there. And you know, when I joined, I didn't join for all these benefits. I joined because when I went into that recruiting office, I told them I want to go to war. I want to fight. And sure enough, I did. But I never went in with the mindset of, you know, oh, I'll get to do my college, or, you know, all these other benefits that you get after you get out. I didn't know about any of them until after I'd gotten out, and my uncle was kind of telling me about, hey, you need to do this with the VA, make sure you're getting your benefits, and, you know, getting me set up.
But, you know, now it seems like you see a lot of the recruiting side of it. I think there is that kind of, hey, join our Army and here's the benefits you get.
Yeah.
Because enlistment is way down.
Yeah.
And that's politics, and we may or may not get into that. It's different. You know, after 9/11, people were energized.
Yeah.
The emotion was there. The patriotism was there.
For sure.
We're seeing the military go a little bit woke right now.
Yeah.
And it's just my dad, God rest his soul, he's probably rolling over his grave, all the things that are going on. But I brought up your kids for a reason, and I want our listeners to know this took us to get this set up was probably 3 different tries to do this podcast. And every time you couldn't do a date I threw out there, it was because, nope, I got my kids. I'm with my kids.
Yeah.
And I admire that. You know, especially when you've got 2 kids from 2 different marriages, mothers. We've seen where a lot of times one gets left aside.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much it. That's not just military families. That's just it's a lot of in general families that go through divorces and splits and all that good stuff. But it's impressive the way you devote your time, and we'll talk more about all of that when we come up. But I wanted the audience to know it took us probably 3 times to get a date.
Yeah.
And we didn't give up, because I'm always one that says, you know, hey, families first, people.
Yeah.
Even with our volunteers at Headwaters for Heroes.
And you told me that.
You know, it's families first, and we'll make it happen.
Yeah.
But I want to go back into deployment. When and where did you actually get into the thick of the fight? And you enlisted because you wanted to go fight. Mm-hmm. So when did you actually get into that?
So after we had gotten back from our first deployment, we had been doing workups. And even on the first deployment, we were being told that we were going to go and protect an embassy, that if an embassy were to come under attack, and I don't know what and why we were tasked with that, but I don't know if there was intel that could possibly happen during that time, and that's why we were tasked with that, and which nothing ended up happening. And so the second deployment, I had to make the decision. They called about 8 of us in, because our enlistment time was getting close to ending. They called us in and they said, hey, you guys need to make a decision on, are you going to extend, or are you going to start to process out? but understand that as you get ready to process out, we're going to be in Afghanistan. And just so y'all know, we are going to a combat deployment. So the men that are in this unit right now, there's a very high chance that some of them are not going to come back. And so I remember sitting in this room. It was a small room about this size, and we kind of sat around, and some of them had just gotten into new relationships. Some had just got married. I think one, he had just had a little baby girl. And so some of them were like, no, I'm going to put my family first. I'm going to, I'm not going to go. And for me, I didn't have any of that. We'd just gotten back. I'd gone through a breakup, and I was like, you know what, I want to go. And they're guaranteeing that we are going to get into it with the Taliban. And, we are going to take the fight to them. And so I just couldn't see myself sitting back and just hearing the stories or hearing about, who'd gotten injured or who ended up, being killed in action while I'm back in the States, and so I made this decision to, I'm gonna extend my contract and go, and I'm glad I did. So we started our workup. It was 2009, pretty much since we got back, 2009, and then we left in 2010, and that whole time of the workup, we knew what we were going to go do. And when it wasn't just going to be our MOS of shooting artillery. And so we had to be what's called an improvised infantry company, because the area that we were going to go and operate, we were going to be protecting a hydroelectric dam, which supplied almost half of Afghanistan with electricity, or at least Helmand province. And the Taliban had been trying for years to try to overtake it and control the electricity so they could tax the people and control them even more. And so we had to, a lot of the Marines in my unit, we had to be trained in other aspects other than our own MOS. So some of us had to be trained doing mortars, which came about pretty easy just because of the knowledge with artillery. It's very similar with the mortars, but like myself, I had to be sent to it was another area there on Pendleton called Margarita, and that's where recon snipers train, and grunts are also there. And so we went, and it was a crash course training on basically how to be a sniper, except we were titled designated marksman. And so I carried the M14, and we were there for about, I think it was 3 weeks before we left. I got designated just because I was a good shot, and out of my platoon, I think there was 6 other candidates, and then we all got interviewed, and I was the more senior corporal at the time, and I pleaded my case. I really wanted to do it, and luckily I was friends, with a lot of the sergeants that were going to make the final decision, and so myself and one other corporal got to go and be trained. So it was special, because in order to be a sniper, you'd have to be an 0311 grunt, and being an 0811, it's not common. So I've run into other grunts before where they, I tell them my story and they think it's BS.
Yeah.
Yeah. And until I show them pictures and I show them certificates, and they're like, oh, okay, you're not trying to be stolen valor over here.
Right.
And so, but one thing that they were very adamant about is, do not go around calling yourself a sniper. You're not recon, you're not a sniper, you are a designated marksman. And I was okay with that. I know that their training is way more extensive than what we were, but when we were there, we were doing a lot of what they were tasked out to do. You're considered a guardian angel, and so I took my job very serious. Anytime I had you know, they'd set me up somewhere where I could overwatch a squad or, you know, whoever. I took it very serious, that title, Guardian Angel, you know. So yeah, that was our first time when I remember our CO coming out right before we went to Afghanistan, and we were in formation. He called everybody, huddled everybody up, and he said, I want y'all to all look to your left and your right, because some of these men are not coming back. Like, this is a for sure thing. And if some of y'all don't want to go on this deployment, you let me know, because I will reassign you to a different unit. I only want men here that realize what they're doing. You're signing a check of your life, and it's either going to get cashed or not. And I remember doing that too. I remember I had posted on Facebook where I had actually wrote out a check and put amount, my life, and I wrote it out.
Wow.
Yeah. I'll have to share it with you sometime. But yeah, I actually wrote it out, and I remember writing out my my will. You know, I remember sitting down and writing my will out, and you know, I had a motorcycle, I had a truck. I didn't have much else than that. You know, I had a little bit of savings from, you know, when I used to work in the oil field, but I didn't really have a whole lot. But it's interesting when, you know, you're that young. I was like 23, 24 when I was getting ready to go to Afghanistan, and, you know, writing a will out. It's, you know, we didn't have to do that on our first deployment. You know, this one they knew for sure, like, hey, some of y'all aren't coming back. So,
well, you know, I got to respect the command for being straight up.
Yeah.
You know, hey, because and I'm not saying that anybody you know, wants to turn tail and run, but you do have to do a lot of soul searching.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like you mentioned a while ago, there were some guys, you know, that were, you know, just married or just in a relationship or just had a kid, and you have to do a lot of soul searching at that point.
Yeah.
And how many bailed, or, you know, if they all stayed, you know, that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
But I got to admire the commander for being so straightforward. I know my dad retired as a lieutenant colonel, and he always talked about, you know, being straight up with the sergeants, being straight up with the men that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that this is what we're up against, and this is how we got to get it done.
Right.
And, you know, then there's no unexpected.
Right.
Now, nobody can because you had never been in war up to this point.
Correct.
So nobody can prepare you
Right.
exactly what that's going to be.
Right. Yeah. We had done some training where they, you know, you're shooting blanks or you're getting shot with paintball. They look like a bullet, but it's basically a paint cartridge in front of a blank cartridge. So you're getting hit pretty hard. It's not just like a regular paintball. The rifle looks just like the rifle, you know, when you're shooting. But, you know, they try to prepare us pretty well with the training that we did prior, because at one point they even sent us to a combat life-saving course where they had pigs, and they would set up different scenarios of, okay, you're going to treat this pig like one of your Marines. And so they would injure the pig, and we'd have to keep the pig alive. We'd have to put it on a stretcher. We'd have to, you know, I mean, we had to learn how to do trikes. We had to learn how to do needle T compression, you know, to relieve pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of things that we were taught prior. But even, you know, the scenarios they put us through, they had like actors come out dressed like foreign national people that were there and prepare us. They're yelling at us in you know, Arabic or and so they try to do a really good job. But until, for me, prior to that, going to these, you know, like this scout sniper school and getting trained, we were always shooting paper targets or shooting these little, you know, that silhouette of a person. But until that moment, I remember the first time, you know, actually looking through my scope. I was up on a rooftop, looking in my scope and actually seeing a person there was a moment there of like, all right, there's no turning back from here, you know. because I struggled for a long time with, being religious, like taking someone's life, and it wasn't until we lost our first Marine that it all changed for me. Like a part of me died because it was kill or be killed. Mm-hmm. That's how it was, and a lot of people talk about, serving and, we're fighting for our country. But when you're there in combat, you're not thinking about back home. You're not thinking about, I'm doing this for my family or doing this for my country. You're doing it for your brothers left and right of you that you're in this firefight in, and making sure that we all get back to our fob, or, because I know a lot of Marines, we all made promises to the wives or to their mothers. Like, I had made a promise to my squad leader's mom. She asked me to promise me that you're going to protect him and that you're going to bring him back home to me. And so that's why I always took that guardian angel with all my Marines, but especially him. I was always looking out for him. I was always trying to, be his guardian angel. So
that's a tough burden to carry up, be someone's guardian.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible. So let's get further into.
Yeah.
You just said, the first time you looked at a person through the scope.
Yeah.
So what happens from there?
Well, it was our first time that we actually had gotten into a firefight. So while we were in Kajaki, so prior to that, we flew out from Maine, and then from Maine we flew into it's Kyrgyzstan, like up near like Germany area. And then from there we flew into Leatherneck, which Leatherneck is there's a Marine side, and then there's Camp Bastion, which is British side. And so when we got tasked with Kajaki protecting the dam, the Brits had already been there and they had already been occupying that area. And so our job was to take over it, and then what was called the flet, it was a forward line of enemy territory. Our job was to push that out, and there was a supply line from southern part of Afghanistan that ran a highway that ran all the way up to Kajaki. And so there was Marines from I believe it was either 3-7 that were trying to push forward up that highway, clearing IEDs on this highway, and our job was just to push the flat out, and then at some point they were going to reach all the way to where we were. And so initially when we, as soon as we landed the helicopter, we were already getting shot at. And initially when we got there, it was, you're constantly bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and very quickly you kind of like start to become numb to getting shot at. And most people, won't ever experience that, experience the, hearing bullets crack and whiz past you. It's a scary thing.
So how do you tune that out? I mean, how do you become numb to it? Is there anything special you do, or is it just over time?
I know, like, during that time, it I guess becoming numb to it, it was like, if it's my time to die, it's my time to die. I had written that check. And so, but with that same mindset, it was kill or be killed. If you didn't return fire back, more than likely, they are going to return fire back to you. So it's just one of those things that you've got to, I think, over time, when you start to fight, you kind of, I guess, adrenaline and everything else, you just start to become numb without even realizing that you're numb to it. Because I remember initially when we'd start getting shot at, before, some of the Marines would drop down to their bellies, and they're like, trying to figure out where we were getting shot at. And then over time, it was just take a knee. Did anyone see where that came from? radio, try to get, intel from, our Overwatch to see if they maybe knew where it was coming from, and then, go from there. But it was, I know that day that we had I had gotten into my first firefight, it was, definitely started to change me. I didn't even realize it. For I guess for the bad too. Like I said, looking down my scope, and prior to the military, I had hunted. You get that buck fever.
Mm-hmm.
You get excited when you're about to pull the trigger, but I didn't get that same excitement. But I knew I needed to do my job because other Marines were relying on me, and so after that, that first firefight, it was a battle within myself of like, in the Bible it talks about, thou shalt not kill, and I'm like, and one of my Marine sergeants was like, had explained it to me in a way that gave me a sense of peace. And so, from that moment, and then after, our first sergeant had stepped on ID and he ended up passing away, there was a switch within me that was like, didn't feel bad about having to kill another person. There was just there was an anger inside of me that was just, I was just angry, and I felt like I needed to avenge, my other Marine brothers that had gotten killed. And so that was my, my thing, especially being, I would be set up. And so a lot of times I would see the enemy before they even started to shoot at us, and, I don't know. I can't say how many, Taliban I killed there. I know that I at least had 4. And so one thing that I really struggled with after even getting back from that deployment, I felt like I almost had like this dark attachment to me. I don't know if it was their spirits or what, but for the longest time I had these dark shadow silhouette figures. Sometimes it wasn't even a silhouette. It was just like this foggy energy that I could see. No one else could see it, but I could feel their presence. And,
wow.
Yeah. And that's where my needing to cope with that and trying to like disconnect, that's when drinking started to really take hold, and just trying to party and trying to keep my mind busy, but keeping my mind busy with not good things.
Well, people think that, well, this is what we're trained to do, and you are, as military. You're trained, as Rush Limbaugh once said, and I say this almost on every session. The military is here to kill and break things.
Yeah.
And you're the best trained. Our military is the best trainer. Well, they were, maybe not right this minute, but they're the best trained.
Yeah.
And people think it's, well, that's what you're trained to do. You're trained to kill.
Yeah.
But it's not that easy.
Right.
And that's what I'm hearing you say is that first time is you're looking at it and it's like, you start to question things. Mm-hmm. And I think it's in Ecclesiastes where it says there's a time to kill and there's a time to heal. And, and yeah, the Bible says thou shalt not kill, but, we can easily, and we're all really bad about interpreting the Bible to suit our needs.
Sure.
Which we shouldn't, but we do it. We're human. God gave us that ability because we're human. It's different, in my opinion, as a military. You're there to defend. Mm-hmm. What were we defending in Afghanistan? Great question. But defending our country, which was founded on Christian moral principles.
Right.
And so, it to me, that isn't just killing for the sake of killing. I think,
Right.
what the Bible tells us about killing is, what you see going on in Chicago or
Right.
these big cities where it's random killings.
Yeah, it's like innocent.
Yeah.
Killing innocent people. And,
Yeah.
and that's what pretty much what that sergeant had told me. He was like, we're not going out killing innocent people. These are enemies even within their own country.
Yeah.
With the local people. They're terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're doing. That's what our job is here to do. And so it did give me a sense of ease, but I struggled with that for a long time, of just trying to let that go. And then eventually I was able to let that go. But then that kind of confusion was replaced with just anger and vengeance towards, if they weren't my Marine brothers, like I was going, and it's hard, especially once you get back from a deployment like that, where you're pretty much every patrol you go on, you're getting into a firefight, which our squad went, I think it was over 42 patrols while we were there. And we'd rotate because there would be a squad that was out patrolling. Then there was a QRF, which would stay in the fob. And so if something happened, they could get in up-armored Humvees and could drive out to certain areas if they needed to pick up someone that was injured or we need more ammo. But for the most part, it was those two. And then there was Overwatch on the peaks because we had a mountain range to the one side of our fob. So we had Marines there. We had Marines pretty much protecting the other side of the dam. So there was multiple, we'd rotate out. There'd be a week where you're patrolling, a week where you're on fob watching the dam, and then there's another week where you're watching the green zone, which the green zone's where we got most of our firefights because it's just so it's, from the peaks you can see where the Sangin River runs through. That's connected where the dam is, where they would dig in these channels to where they could water their crops. So that green zone was where they would plant all their corn and whatever else, marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
They had like poppy,
Mm-hmm.
Was real big, and so all that stuff, that's how they would water all their the green zone. But what was scary, though, the area that we were at was so heavily covered with IEDs. Everywhere we went, and I know other parts of Afghanistan were different, but where we had to Valen everywhere. We had a metal detector where we had to metal detect everywhere we went, and we actually had we had these spray paint cans, and we would even use empty water bottles that we'd fill with baby powder. And we poke a hole in the top, and so a Marine, 2 or 3 of the Marines that were right behind the Valen man would mark the lane so that we knew where to walk and not step out of that path. Because if you stepped outside that path, it hadn't been Valen, so they didn't know. And then we had HME dogs that would, if there was an area that we needed sniffed out, if we were going to cross a certain area, our squad leader would send out the dog and they'd sniff, and then if it smelled anything or could smell the explosives, they would lay down. And one of our canines actually was killed that way. It ended up laying down on the pressure plate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I believe her name was Lydia. And I believe so my understanding in the Marine Corps, whoever the dog handler is, whatever rank they are, the dog is one rank above them. So if the dog handler is a corporal, the dog is a sergeant.
Really?
Yeah, and I believe she was a sergeant. If not, she was a staff sergeant. But she was one of our I think she was our third KIA while we were there, which that was, a blow too, because we had 2 dogs while we were there. So that was hard because, the dogs were like, when they weren't working, they were, kind of would help the morale.
Yeah.
getting to pet the dog and the dog's licking you. You know, it's
They're part of the unit. They're,
yeah.
you know, it's I get that. I
Yeah.
mean, it's, you know, and well, I heard that over there that they don't like dogs.
I don't know. I never heard that. There was a lot of stray dogs that were out there, and there was this one dog. Now that we're talking about dogs, there was this one dog. It was a big, huge. I believe it was a lab, and I forget what his name was, but he was tore up. He was a big old dog, but apparently him and some of the other strays, they would get into fights with some of the jackals that were out there. They're kind of like coyotes.
Yeah.
And you could see that he had gotten into some fights with them, and he would follow us around on patrols, and there was times that we would change our path because the dog would start walking off on this other path and almost leading us. And so and he was this big old mean looking white dog, but he was friendly to us. And we always felt like he was almost kind of like guiding us at times.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And so we you know, when they would come on the fob, they'd come and go off the fob when they wanted. You know, they were stray. They, you know, when they weren't there, we didn't know where they were. But when they would come to the fob, you know, we'd feed them and give them water and stuff. And then sometimes on patrols, they'd be right there in the middle of it with us. I think at one point that dog was in a firefight with one of us. And so we were,
No way.
all of us were joking. We're like, you know, is he going to get a combat action ribbon?
Yeah.
You know? So
that'd be cool.
yeah. But yeah.
So tell us what led to your getting the Purple Heart.
So when I got injured, it was October 5th, 2010. We had already been out in the green zone for roughly 3 days. And we had gone out there initially to relieve another squad that had been out there, because we had been getting intel of these Taliban coming in, and they were planning IEDs, and that they were also sending snipers up. And so we were trying to detain them before they got into our AO. We were out there on it was our last night. We were getting ready to go back to the fob because the other squad had come in, and the night prior we had gotten into a little firefight. It didn't last long. And we had some Marine intel that were up on the peaks. They could translate, and they were hearing the chatter that they were hearing from their radios, and they kept saying that they were going to send the big gun. And so there was a lot of times we'd go on patrols and we'd hear stuff like that, where they were going to send a sniper, or they were, they're going to do this or do that. And so that time we kind of blew it off. We didn't really think a whole lot of it. And so that night, I remember I was on fire watch. I did the first watch, and it was after we had gotten into a little firefight, and we all got back to our compound, and we were getting fire watch set up. And my grandma had always told me, while you're in Afghanistan, you ever look at the moon, know that I prayed for you that night. And so that night I remember looking up at the moon and was thinking, like, what my family must be doing. And thinking back, I didn't do a whole lot of praying while I was there. But I believe that I had a guardian angel while I was there. And that night I remember laying up underneath this big tree that was coming out of this compound, which out of all the other compounds, there wasn't any trees. It wasn't common. And there really wasn't a whole lot of trees in the green zone. If they were kind of small. So I remember laying up underneath this tree, and I remember praying and just, for whatever reason, because I hadn't done it before, I prayed and just prayed for protection over my squad, and then I fell asleep while I was praying. And then I remember being woken up by one of the Marines saying, "Hey, it's your turn." And I remember it was already starting to become morning. Sun's already getting ready to come up, and you could kind of see a little bit. And I got my gear on, got ready, got up on top of the compound, and you know, the other squads went out on their patrols that day, and we kept hearing, you know, that they were going to be sending the big gun, is what they kept saying over the radio. And for some reason, I got this weird feeling, and I didn't know what it was, but it must have been the Holy Spirit telling me, "Hey, this is what you need to do." And I listened, because a lot of times I'd kind of shrug it and like, I probably shouldn't speak up, or I shouldn't say, you know, keep my mouth shut. And that time, I'm glad that I did, that I listened to that voice, because I went and told my squad leader, because we weren't supposed to leave that compound till about 30 to about an hour later. And I went up and told him, I was like, "We need to leave this compound," because we were going to go and do our last patrol before we went back to the FOB. And he said, "Why? Like, what's up?" Like, you know, I'd never had told him or advised him on anything unless he had asked me. And so I told him we need to leave within the next 30 minutes. And so I was like, we need to be out of here so that we can be set up before the sun goes down, and then we can make our way back, or already be making our way back before it gets completely dark. And he said, "Okay, that's fine." You know, he's like, the probability though of us leaving and them seeing us is high, and they're going to want to get into a firefight. And I'm like, well, all the Marines want to get into a firefight. We carried all this ammo out here. Like, let's use it, you know? And so
be a lighter load going on.
Yeah, a lighter load going back. And so he said, "Okay, let's go." So we got ready. I got all the Marines ready. I said, "Let's go." And so sure enough, we had just left the compound, and we were probably maybe like 60, 70 yards from the compound, and we heard this whooshing sound, and we didn't know what it was initially, and then we heard an impact. Well, they had shot an RPG at the compound, and so we're trying to figure out what's going on, and I'm positioning myself, looking out in this cornfield, and I could see Taliban trying to flank us. And I don't think they would realize that we were already where we were. And so I remember looking down this, it was like a long hallway because of the way that the buildings were positioned. And we were always told, if you see someone with an RPG, take them out. It's not a, you know, you don't shoot until you get shot at first, because that was normal rules of engagement. You can't shoot unless you get shot at first, or they point their weapon at you. And so I remember seeing him down this long hallway of where the compounds were, and I took a shot and he went down. And then at that point, the cornfield to our right lit up. As soon as I took my first shot, I guess they knew we were there, and so we started getting shot at. My 240 gunner came running over to me, and I was telling him where they were, and he literally stood up like in the movie Rambo and just started just shooting into the cornfield. I told him they're in the cornfield. So he stood up, and I remember just seeing, everything's in slow motion. I remember just seeing just the corn just like falling over. I mean, he was cutting it down. And so I'm trying to get on the radio to my squad leader, which he was further back, and asking him, "Hey, did they get any injuries at the compound?" Because I could hear screaming from where we were, and they were returning fire, and he said they're saying that there's 6 injured, because my radio was acting up, and we had a corpsman with us, and they said that the other corpsman had gotten injured. And so I told him, well, me and Doc Collins, we can run back. Let me take a couple of Marines, and y'all stay here, cover the this side of our flank, and we'll run back. And so I grabbed the corpsman and 2 other Marines, and we ran back to the compound. And what we had thought was an RPG was actually a 73 millimeter cordless rocket that's designed to take out a tank that they had launched and hit inside the compound. And apparently earlier that day, there was this kid that was walking around, and we ended up detaining him for a little while. Well, later we found out that that kid was pacing out the distance from inside the compound outside, and was relaying back to them how many steps it took him to get to the middle of the compound, so that they knew where to dial it just right, so that that rocket would hit inside the compound. And so the first rocket that it hit, 6 Marines were injured. Segura was one of them. I remember taking care of Segura. When I first ran in the compound, there was still a lot of dust in the air. And I don't know if it was from the rocket or just the Marines running around. There was just a lot of dust kicked up in the air. Initially, it took a little while for the dust to finally settle. And so there was Marines up on top of the compound firing back, and then all the other Marines that were injured. And I remember taking care of Segura. I mean, having to, and he was mad because he had just got back because he had gotten injured like a couple weeks prior, and they had just released him to come back. So this was already what was going to be his second Purple Heart. Wow. And he had gotten issued all new camis. And so he was pissed that I had cut up his camis, and because he was bleeding all over the place. And so I'm running they tell us to claw the skin, and if there's a hole, your finger will sink into it. Yeah. And so I'm cutting his pants, and he's pissed off at me. He's like, "No, don't cut him."
I can imagine.
He's like, and
knowing him, I can imagine. I can imagine.
Yeah, and I'm like, "Shut up! You're bleeding all over the place. We don't know where you're bleeding from. We need to stop the bleeding. You're bleeding like a stuck hog." I was like, "Shut up!" And so I didn't say. So
this is where he lost his arm.
So this is during that time. Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. And so he's bleeding all over the place. He had shrapnel that just missed his heart, and then he had gotten shrapnel to his legs, to his back, and so I checked him over. We tried to stop the bleeding as much as we could. We had one of our and during this whole time, he never lost consciousness. He never, he was just so calm. It was weird that he was just, and he said, "Just get me to the helicopter." And we tried to, we had 2 other Marines that were going to help him to the helicopter. And he's like, "Oh, I only need one." He put his arm around the one Marine. He said, "Walk me to the helicopter, get me over there." And he walked on his own power over to the helicopter was about 3 football fields from where our compound was. That's how far they had to land, because initially they were the British. It was a British helo. Initially, they didn't want to land because they said the LZ's hot. We can't land that close, otherwise we're going to get hit. And so they ended up landing a little bit further off so that they didn't, get shot. And so during that time, after Segura left the compound, I started to take care of the other Marines that were in there, and pretty much everyone just had shrapnel. One of the Marines' head was cracked open. His I think it was his left arm that was just mangled pieces. And prior to the Marine Corps, I had been in this program called the Explorers, where we got to ride out with fire, EMS, and police. And so I had seen my share of trauma,
right,
going on. And I enjoyed riding out with EMS. And so I had seen a lot of trauma prior to the Marine Corps. So none of that stuff bothered me. Blood does not bother me. So I started taking care of some of the Marines, getting them, make sure they weren't bleeding out. And then we got ready to take them to the helicopter. And so by this time, it's already starting to get dark out. And so I'm helping carry one of the Marines to the helicopter, and it's by then it's already pretty dark out. It's hard to see where you're walking, and it's not just super flat to just walk. They have these channels where they like water their crops, mm-hmm. So you're having to walk on these little like 2-foot space of dirt, and if you step off, you're stepping into mud and wet soil, mm-hmm. And so you got to, and it was hard carrying Marines to the LZ and not get, stepping in all the wet mud and everything. And so we carried the Marines, got them to the LZ, and it was on my way back. I ran into my lieutenant. Because by then it was completely black. It was really hard to see. And I remember running into him, and he was carrying one of the canines that had gotten injured. The dog had taken shrapnel to its legs, and I ran into him, and he handed me the dog off and said, get him to the LZ. So I went to the LZ, dropped off the dog, ran back for the second time to get one of the other Marines, and that's when the second rocket hit. And if it wasn't for the tree that I had prayed on the night before, that tree took majority of the blast, I wouldn't be here today.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I thank God for that tree being there, because if it wasn't for that tree, I wouldn't be here. And I saw that as God's protection over me. At the time I didn't, but now looking back, I can see that was him protecting me by that tree being there. So I was knocked unconscious. I suffered a grade 3 traumatic brain injury. I got hit with shrapnel, but majority of it hit my flak, my plate carrier. And the thing is when I got injured, I don't remember. All I remember is seeing like a bright white light and the heat, and that was it. And then the next time I came to was conscious, I was in the hospital.